I don't know. Alan sets himself up pretty good for that November 16th decision, don't you think? Thank you so much for all coming out today. I know it's a tough travel day, but I'm always appreciative to see a room like this, first thing in the morning, first thing in the year, talking about the future of the economy, the future of our communities. And it's such an important thing that we have everyone in that engaged fashion come together like this. So I have to applaud Rob and CenterState for having the forum for this kind of event each year. It's one of the best events that I do in my many travels around the upstate world and outside of New York State. And again, it starts with engagement. We have a number of challenges from an economic growth perspective in central New York. There's no secret to that. We'll see some of those later in my presentation. But if we don't start with an engaged populace, people that want to make decisions better, come together to chart that course for the future, you're not going to get the economy that we need. So again, I applaud all of you for being here today. I think we can share some information with you that will help you make better decisions. Not all of it will be pleasant, unfortunately. I wish I had some better news on growth trends, but I think we have some encouraging signs, particularly when you start to throw around the B number, billions, that will be invested in this community and this region over the coming years. I'm going to start off today with taking a look at the U.S. outlook. The best way to look at where we are going in 2016 and beyond is to look at how we got to where we are today. And we're going to start with Economics 101, GDP growth. On this slide, we have both the last 5 years and the last 10 quarters. One of the big hallmarks of this slide really is that there isn't a pattern that we can really rely on as business people to chart our course. We were really encouraged a year or so ago when we were seeing stronger quarter-over-quarter growth above the 3% threshold that we really need to see to get that better economic tenor and tone that we have not had in this recovery. But unfortunately, we've had some setbacks, and right now, volatility is the word of the day as we start to look ahead to the coming year. Our estimation is we finished up on somewhat of a moderate note in the fourth quarter of last year. Only about 1.8% growth heading into the year, so we're not getting a real boost from that holiday shopping in our estimation to propel us into 16. But regardless of what it is, this is the new normal to some extent. The fact that we have to manage in somewhat sluggish times, variable times. Okay, it is laggy. One thing we can rely on though, is this, and that's job growth, which has been, despite that variable nature of overall top-line economic activity, remarkably consistent. We had another great jobs report just last Friday for the month of December. We've created jobs at a clip of 2.5 million plus per year over the last several years. This past year, 2015, 2.9 million new jobs created in the private sector. New private sector paychecks, new private spending power that will be deployed. So this is the underpinnings of a better economy. We expect this to continue heading into the coming year for a good reason. Job openings. 5.4 million job openings in the country right now. The November number just came out the other day, and again, 5.4 million. The best set of job opening numbers we've seen since the late 1990s. And this is the potential that we have for 2016. As these jobs get filled, the new income that comes with them will be deployed in consumer spending and underpin the economy at a rate that we can at least have a floor in the economy. I know it's uncertain times when we look at equity markets, et cetera, the turbulence that we see, but the underpinnings of the U.S. economy are on the consumer, they're on spending, and the health of the labor markets nationally will underpin 2016 in a very good fashion. To give you a sense of that spending potential, as we've seen labor markets improve nationally, we've also seen consumer spending growth come up a bit. We'd like to see it more in the 3% range, but by and large, consumers have been doing their part. And again, that will play out in 2016. If you look again at the underpinnings of the U.S. economy, 70% of GDP is really predicated on what you, I, and all the households in the country do in terms of our spending decisions. With more employment, with more income, with more ability to spend, we expect again 2016 to have some moderate growth in terms of that aspect of our economy. So the consensus forecast, about another 2.5% growth this coming year, not gangbusters growth by any stretch of the imagination. We really need to see some better numbers in terms of net exports, which are dragging us down, in terms of inventory correction, which is underway right now to get into that better term. But in terms of having a floor to go with and having the consistency of knowing how to manage it in this environment, I think the U.S. again will have another year, much like we've seen in the last several years, of moving forward. We want to see better growth, but we'll take this because, frankly, in a global economy that is struggling right now, the U.S. is one of the more shining lights in terms of economic growth. And again, it's really predicated on what spending power from consumers is doing. The Federal Reserve has certainly voted for more confidence in the outlook by raising short-term interest rates for the first time in a number of years. The expectation, though, is that the Fed will not pull the punch bowl away too fast. They will be very moderate in the increases that are expected over the course of this year and next. Our expectation is by the end of 2017, short-term rates will only be up about 100 basis points, 1% in layman's terms. That is not going to derail many of the business plans that I expect you have in terms of cost of credit, cost of capital, et cetera. And the same goes on the longer end of the curve, 10 years or so, where the Fed doesn't have direct control, but as influencing power. This is going to, again, be a moderate increase in interest rates over the next several years, which will again be favorable for economic development, for using capital and credit to leverage activities. The Fed is going to be very accommodative, even though we're starting to see the beginning of interest rate increases. So, we must be getting back to normal if the Fed's starting to move, right? Not really. I wish I had better news in terms of some aspects that we'll look at here that will be with us for several more years to come. Chief among them is the labor market is still not humming on in perfect sync with what's happening in the economy. There are too many people still sitting on the sidelines, including prime working age individuals that aren't just looking for a job, but aren't even participating in many respects in the economic activity of their regions. We need to be able to draw this important resource back into the economy to leverage the talent that we have in the country, not just nationally, regionally as well. We're going to see this problem again when we get to the central New York slides. It's a critical aspect of economic development to have talent, to be able to use that talent and move forward. And right now, this is one of the biggest challenges we have in the country. We're also seeing this economy play out somewhat differently depending on what industry you're in, what markets you serve, a number of different variables. We're not at an escape speed growth rate yet that we are lifting all boats at the same rate. Just looking at the top slide here, goods producers versus service providers. The broader economy, a service-based economy where 70% of economic output takes place, has actually been doing quite well, continues to do quite well. Goods producers, on the other hand, which consist of manufacturers, mining, construction, et cetera, not so well. Actually, just trying to get back to where we were before 2007 is quite an accomplishment in that world. Even in the goods producing world, we're seeing different rates of speed. Construction activity nationally starting to improve, starting to move back into a higher gear. At the same time, we're seeing manufacturing and mining particularly go the other direction. So depending on what industries you're in, you will feel differently about the economy. We expect this to play out in 2016 as well, and we'll be closely watching manufacturing and mining as we head into the year, obviously with turbulence in commodity prices around energy, and also with some of the rising dollar impact around what it does to U.S. exports. We all have to watch the global economy as well. As much as the U.S. economy is moving forward, many parts of the globe are not, and particularly areas that were once the high flyers, the lesser developed countries, the newer economies of the global community, if you will, and China being the epicenter of that right now. These are all factors that we will have to watch closely. We're in an interconnected world now. We cannot just think what happens here in the U.S. is all that matters. This will, again, be something as we look ahead to 2016 that we'll have to keep a careful and close eye on. So what do all these trends mean for Central New York? Central New York is part and parcel of all these trends, but we also operate in our own dynamic. We all have our own challenges and issues to look at as we move forward. That's what this breakfast is for on an annual basis. We'll be discussing those in my presentation and Rob's presentation regarding the survey results, and also each one of us in terms of making the decisions inside our households and businesses. Let's start with sort of the crux of what's happening here in CenterState region. Less bust, but also less boom, I think is a good way to characterize our economic patterns. During the early stages of this recovery, we were performing better than the rest of the country, which isn't something that happens very often in economic history of the U.S. Unfortunately, for the last 3 years, however, we have continued to move sideways while the rest of the country is zoomed by. And that is going to be the challenge as we look to 16 and beyond, is how do we move the needle? How do we energize growth to get into a pattern that looks more like the ascendancy of the rest of the country? If we continue to move sideways, that gap will continue to widen. And it's up to us to make sure that we do everything in our power to move the needle here, to make sure that we have an economy that is performing and looking more like what we saw earlier in this recovery than in the last couple of years. If you look at employment, the same sort of trend comes to the fore. In 2015, Central New York job growth did lag, not just the national average, but also some of the upstate peers, particularly those in the western and eastern part of upstate, where job growth was in a better fashion like the U.S. more than it has typically been in past years. We need to get the center of the state to come into that fold as well and move the jobs needles forward, because again, jobs create income, create spending power, create economic activity. This is, again, something we have to focus on with a labor force that we'll talk about in a moment that needs some help. But what about unemployment, you might say? I read in the paper every month when the numbers come out that we've been getting better, getting more like before the Great Recession occurred. And it's true. The official numbers, if you seasonally adjust them like we do, have been moving downward and look very much like the rest of the country. In the 5% range is not a bad number for upstate New York. Any part of upstate New York, not a bad number for the country, frankly. That number has been steadily improving the last 3 years, but unfortunately, much of that has been due to this phenomenon, and that's labor force contraction. If there's one thing we really have to put a line in the sand on around in economic development terms in Central New York, upstate New York, and the country, it's making sure that we don't allow our labor pool to continue to contract. We've seen that happen here in Central New York, unfortunately. Some of it is demographics, the aging out of older workers, leaving the labor pool, but it's critical for economic development to have that raw material, labor, to go into the equation. And any of the economic development initiatives that we have in the coming years for this region have to focus on this dynamic. We need that critical pool of good labor to be able to move our needle forward. I mentioned the aging out of older workers. Much of that is occurring in our manufacturing sector. And one of the biggest headwinds we've had that has kept this region at its stasis point the last several years has been the dynamic around its manufacturing base. During the early stages of the recession, we are much like the rest of the country in terms of that labor dynamic, but we have not seen in the recovery in the last several years a movement much like we're seeing elsewhere. We're still seeing some contraction in that world. And in terms of supporting our homegrown manufacturing base, our new and emerging manufacturing base, again, critically important if we want to narrow the gap with the rest of the country. Policies around supporting manufacturing are still critical. Much of my next remarks will be moving away from manufacturing towards more of the newer economy, but that manufacturing component that built upstate New York and built central New York is still critically important to support. And again, this dynamic has been one of the biggest headwinds we've had to face. I want to sort of finish my remarks talking about the challenge of rebuilding an economy on the fly. It's not just headwinds from the old economy that, if you will, around manufacturing and government that we have had blowing in our face for quite some time now here, but the lack of the new, if you will, the lack of economy 2.0 type industries, and a phrase I like to use, the eds and meds world, education and healthcare, advanced manufacturing is a component of this, information, professional business services, finance, construction, real estate, these kind of industries that you see remarkably in areas that continue to grow at a better rate are areas that we have a bit of a deficit on here in central New York. Our economy has not really been built for the future. It's been built for what we've had in the past. And the challenge we face as policy leaders, business leaders, and just in our everyday lives is moving to the new. In the words of the late David Bowie, change, change, change. That's what we need to embrace. And taking that risk and moving into these broader areas to strengthen and diversify our economy is going to be critical. It's linked to how well we do in terms of income as well. So it's not just moving an economy for the economy's sake, but to moving it to the betterment of all of us in terms of our personal income growth. Areas that have that larger diversified base tend to do better in terms of income growth. And you can see the challenge we face relative to not just the US numbers here, but also to our upstate peers that have been making that challenge happen. I'll give you an example of that. In my hometown, Buffalo, we have been seeing remarkable resurgence in areas that we have not really been known for. The economy 2.0 industry growth that we have seen in Buffalo has been one of the biggest things that has come out of the last several years in terms of our forward progress. We've grown those sectors of our economy in Buffalo to a much greater extent than the typical US metro area. We've put a larger part of our economy in those baskets, 58% as opposed to 52%, whereas central New York, on the other hand, has not really moved the needle much in that regard. So if there's something that we can focus on from a really long-term perspective here that's critically important is expansion and diversification into new sectors of our economy. How do we get there? How do we pick the areas that we need to focus on to get away from where we've been? Because frankly, what we've been doing has been challenging and not really working that well. Some encouraging signs in the second half of 2015 from some of the growth in these Economy 2.0 sectors, education and healthcare, for example, adding a number of new jobs, trade and leisure hospitality, sort of the consumer spending sectors of the economy looking positive, but frankly, we need to bring other areas forward as well. The areas of New York State, the areas of the country that are experiencing the best growth had the fewest number of bars moving backwards. And in most cases don't have any bars moving backwards. We still have something of a job growth hokey pokey going on here to some extent in terms of several of our sectors just not getting that growth that we need. So as we look forward to 2016 and beyond, the challenge is how do we lift all of these sectors to move them forward? One of the ways we can do that, and I'll finish up, I think, on a positive note to set up Rob for, I'm sure, what will be a celebration of a few things. Making the economy we need is part of the process. It's not just letting the economy hit you and happen to you. It's stirring the pot a bit. I think we have two good examples here of stirring that pot to try and recombine our DNA into new forms. I think those will be quite encouraging as we get into the future. But really, I think the celebration probably today and in the next several years is going to be around the fact that we now have more resources to throw at these problems than we've had in the past. We have to make great decisions around that. We have to have a really good plan and execute on it. And we have to have the engagement, again, of everyone in the community that moves things forward. One of the most encouraging things I've seen in upstate New York over the last several years is more consensus and less negotiation is a nice way of maybe putting it for what's my piece of the pie. I think we all have to come together to make sure that the pie expands and work hard to make sure that that dialogue is part of the process and not just having schisms, if you will, or what's in it for me. I think we have to come together, and now that we have some resources, now that we have some leverage that will unlock some of the private sector spending, I think we have a lot of opportunity ahead of us. I'll finish my remarks then on what I think the best part of what we have to look forward to in the next several years is when the Buffalo Billion Initiative was created, I know there was a lot of envy around upstate New York because of that. Frankly, a lot of that money, most of that money, the bulk of that money has not actually been spent. The progress we're seeing, though, is that the unlocking of entrepreneurial risk-taking, knowing that that investment from the state is out there, has been remarkable. And the progress we've made in Western New York, the progress we're seeing in Rochester, the progress we're seeing in Albany, all around sort of coming together to take more risks, try to change our economic direction, try to recombine what we do well into what we can do better in the future. That's the challenge for Central New York today. It's the challenge that will be with us for the next several years, frankly, forever, if you will, in the economy that we live in. We have seen some progress, but we're going to have a lot more. With that, then, I'm going to cede the stage to Rob, who I know is a great ringmaster when it comes to giving you the good news about what we can do to get better. I encourage you all to be part of that process. I thank you again for coming out again, to being here, to being part of the problem's solution, not part of the problem's problem. Thank you again, and I hope to see you soon next year. Thank you.